So let me begin today morning with a real, by saying that Second Samuel 6 is a portion of the Bible which is very popular, but at the same time, it has quite a large implications for us as a Christian, right? It really connects what's happening in the Old Testament to what really is about to come in the New Testament, right? It connects the two covenants together, the old and the new, right? And I think I feel completely, my knowledge and everything, it's not up to par. I feel like to have really, taken care of all the different angles and perspectives, if you may, right, of this portion, because it is quite intense in that sense. Even though the storyline, what we're going to cover is quite straightforward, and so I'm hoping that a lot of you will have a lot of thoughts around this quite known story, and hopefully, although I did send the questions a little late, had some opportunity to look into those questions, and I would say those were rather straightforward questions in terms of why certain events were really happening in this chapter, right? So to just to reset where we are in this Bible study, I think last week Sushil covered Second Samuel 5 1 through 25, and essentially we saw David establish, sort of move out of Hebron and conquer Jerusalem and make it his capital city, right? And I think it made sense to do so because he definitely is in the thought process of wanting to unite all the 12 tribes, stop the warring fractions, maybe the civil war what that was going on, and he didn't want to make a choice of the united capital city for Israel in a place which is more towards the south versus north, right? So he sort of picked Jerusalem, which was occupied by Jebusites, right? Which is not really falling in the north or the south, and sort of in the middle of that whole political divisions, right? And so essentially, he did really outlined his political strategy in this, trying to make that city the prominent city for himself, right? Along with this, we also saw that Jerusalem is also referred to as Zion, the city of David, as well as his relationship with King of Tyre, Hiram, who essentially built a palace for David. Ultimately, we also see something which should have happened long before, which is the ending of Philistines, which they were creating a lot of problems all through those years. Israelites were moving towards the promised land. They were kind of constantly in conflict with Philistines. Real big wars, lost Saul and a lot many more Israelites in those wars against Philistines. So ultimately, he did what should have been done long back to finish off Philistines. So now, really, it is a phase where the nation building can start, and that's where we sort of graduate into Second Samuel 6. And the centerpiece of this chapter is the Ark of the Covenant. And I think this would have been covered in previous chapters, even Genesis, starting from Genesis, Exodus, all those portions. We have dealt in detail of the construction, make, how it is, who made it, why it was made. All that is covered. So I don't intend to cover it, but at the end of the day, this one artifact that has been eluding coming back to Israel and be rightfully placed in Jerusalem, if you may. And I think that's the gap, the spiritual gap that David is trying to fulfill in this 2 Samuel 6. We know that this is a rectangular box, 3.5 feet, 2.5 feet wide, and as well as 2.5 feet high, right? At the end of the day, it's a wooden box overlaid with gold, mercy seat on the top, cherubims on either side facing each other, right? And what makes it powerful is really the presence of God. So it symbolizes something, and physically as well, this is where God resides among people, right? This is one way in which God was able to be with sinful people or in this case specifically the sinful people of Israel, right? So it has a huge and tremendous importance, how the nation will be built. So David's vision, obviously, of course, there was a political aspect of it, but this is more the religious aspect of it, right? He wants to make Jerusalem the centerpiece for both, and so that he can build that whole country around it, right? So he has a very correct approach and right thought processes, if you may, to as the the Israel is coming to birth, essentially. Some of the themes are, he tries to do this, bring home the Ark of Covenant twice in this chapter. First time was a failure, and we'll see why. And then there was a second attempt where he actually rectifies some of the issues he sort of presented, he actually went through, and then he was successful in bringing the ark back to Jerusalem. In between, we see some events, specifically God's judgment against Uzzah, as well as God's judgment against Michal, wife of David. So we'll sort of introspect in that as well. I think the question helps us to explore those portions a little bit more. But the general theme of this chapter, as I put down in the blue at the bottom, is essentially God's work must be done in God's way alone, and with total obedience and humbleness towards Him. So this theme about being obedient and being humble is consistent throughout the Bible, and it's no different in 2 Samuel chapter 6 as well, right? It's not enough to do the God's work, but it has to be done in the most prescriptive way of how God tells you to do so, right? Not, it's not about my intentions are good. It's more about what did God say to me, how it has to be done, right? So we'll explore a little bit of that in this chapter, and then of course, I think Sushil brought it up. The way we try to understand these portions is three different perspectives, right? So one is in the light of God's purpose, as to what is that God is trying to do with people of Israel, right? His own people. What is He trying to do in that time, that era? Second is, the inspired authorship of the person who is writing the portion. And we have to understand this very clearly, that it's not just that if I were to be in that time, it's not like Rajiv sitting somewhere alone, right, in his own thoughts and making some story up. It's an inspired authorship, right? It is inspired through Holy Spirit. So that continuation, that ultimately it's one author, right? That is threaded through, and that has to be kept in mind, right? So it's not very distinct stories, or just because it is different people writing, it's disjointed, and it is not is really, and all the way up to the New Testament coming of Jesus, it just stays. Bible is a living Bible is the word of God. So we have to remember that it's not just people writing it, right? And then of course, in the light of what does that implies or points towards the coming of the New Testament, and really, how is the new, what does it say about Jesus Christ, right? The new covenant, I should have said, the new covenant that's coming through in the New Testament, right? So all that's really the nice way to sort of link up what you read in the Old Testament, and this thought process that somehow we are dealing with a different God in Old Testament and then a completely different God in a New Testament is not right? So it is all one God, different scenarios, different perspectives, right? Hopefully that's helpful, and we're going to keep this theme as we go forward, myself and Sushil. So here is the first question as we get into it, right? So as I said, David's intentions were good. I would say it is great because he's already done his political bid. He made sure that people are appeased in the sense that nobody is having a crib about where the capital city should be lying. So fantastic. He's a strategist. He is a thinking person. Great, right? Now he's trying to also make sure that it is also a religious capital. So right after about 20 years, right, this Ark of Covenant is being brought back from Baal Judah or Kiryat Jearim, right, from the house of Abinadab. So this is really one of those times where for that much amount of time, the presence of God is not with Israel. Essentially, you can see that, right? And they have suffered because of it. And really, David understands the principle that and as a man in God's own heart, he's craving for that. I think that craving is still with all of us as well, right? Nothing in this world, quite honestly, right, satisfies any of us, I would venture and say, than having, when once you have the presence of God in your heart, right? You could have the money, you could have great vacations. At the end of the vacation, you're pretty much going to feel about the same, right? So though we just go from one excitement to another, but nothing satiates your inner hunger. And I think that's what David is really going after. So if that is the case, the question is, of course, his first attempt fails miserably with the killing of Uzzah, and essentially God strikes him down. So the question is, why did God punish Uzzah if all he did? And if you remember the story, they were taking the Ark of the Covenant in a new ox cart, and and if you think about what Philistines did was about the same, right? Once they were punished for having the ark, they sent back the ark in an ox cart as well, right? They send it back, and they send it to Bethshemesh, and then finally it is moved to where it is, where currently, right? So they are essentially doing what the Philistines did: put up the ark on an ox cart and send it along the way. And along the way, the cart actually destabilizes, and the ark is about to fall, right? And Uzzah, Abinadab's son, one of the sons, right? Uzzah and Ahio were the two sons, right? So one of them puts up his hands to just prevent it from falling, right? And so for that mistake, he is instantly eliminated from. He's destroyed. Essentially, he's dead. He's killed. So the question is that why did God really punish him? That is one. And did this action really warrant such a harsh punishment as death? Okay. So I think both angles, which is, just looking at what is happening, as well as, the references to the Mosaic law, right? I think both came about, right? And I'm gonna probably reiterate, but just give you a few references of where specifically, this has been quoted, right? So first, let's just look at the ark itself, right? What exactly is the content of the ark, for example? So the ark, of course, the box and the rods to carry it, gold plated, mercy seat, cherubims, right? But Hebrews 9:14 talks about how the ark has a golden urn holding the manna, right? As well as Aaron's staff, that, if you remember that story, which is the only staff that budded, right, and bear fruits, essentially, right? And the tablets of the covenant, which is essentially your 10 commandments, the covenant, written covenant that God has made with the people of Israel, right? So these objects are of great importance to Israel as a people, right? It really, for example, the golden urn containing the manna is from the days in which the Israelites were in the wilderness, right? And it shows the bountiness of God. It tells them that God is sufficient for next 40 years almost. They ate on manna, right? And this is something that God provisioned for them. Aaron's staff uh, really tells how they are, a selected group of people, right? The priesthood, it symbolizes, right? And then, of course, the covenant itself, it's a word of God, right? They're literally carrying the living word of God, the covenant itself. And then, of course, this is all of great spiritual significance for the people of Israel, right? So that's why ark by itself is quite important, right? And so then, we also understand, I think, the presence of God is felt in the ark, right? So literally, the God would come in on the top of the mercy seat between the cherubims, right? And then they would talk to the Levites within the Israeli, the selected Levites who would talk to God directly, and then that message will be taken back to the people, right? That used to be the format. And of course, yearly they would have their religious ceremonies around that particular ark, essentially, right? So if somebody says, how do I know it had any kind of strength? God's presence is holy, God's presence is strong, right? How do we know that, right? So let's look at few of the examples, right? I mean, one of the examples where Ark was instrumental in giving victory to Israelites was, if you see the crossing of Jordan, right? So essentially, it's essentially parted Jordan so that they could pass through that river. Joshua 3:16, right? Joshua 6:20 talks about how the strongholds of Jericho, the walls, impenetrable walls of Jericho, sort of crumbled down as soon as they went around the, of course, the prescribed way, right? Like went around the city with the ark 7 times, and then they shouted to bring down the complete walls, right? And of course, the ark was by itself. First Samuel 5:6, right? When it went to Philistine country, right? So it created so much trouble for them, right? Tumor, sores, plagues, right? That they have literally sent back the ark the way they took it to that land, right? Nobody was helping the ark per se. It didn't require an Israelite to fight for the ark, right? Ark took care of it itself. As a matter of fact, Dagon, their god, when it was placed along with Dagon, Dagon was found face down the next morning. And when they were put back again the following morning, his head and hands were severed with just leaving the stumps, right? So it clearly shows us that the God's presence is with that ark, right? It's not no more a box. It's no more a staff or gold-plated lids. It is literally the presence of God that is with that ark of covenant, right? So it's of great significance. Of course, Bible does talk about few other arcs, right? I mean, just Noah's ark is there, Moses' ark. It's not really a big ark, but the ark that his mother made so that Moses can be floated out, right? As well as the Ark of the Covenant. And then it also talks about how these arks individually were transported. For example, the Noah's ark transported based on the flood. Flood waters took it away, right? Moses, again, his mother transported it, right? And let's see what does the Ark of the Covenant. So what does it say? The Bible says about how it has to be moved around, right? Of course, everybody talked about having poles. Exodus 25:15 talks about it cannot be touched, right? It has permanently fixed poles through their golden rings, right? And that's the only way it has to be moved around, right? And whenever they are moving around, it has to be in hidden way, right? It cannot be just exposed to normal atmosphere or just to be seen by everybody, right? That itself causes death, and we know that, right? So these are the few places where really, where it has been clarified that what is the method and who. For example, in the Levite tribe as well, right? It's not that everybody can just go and do this service for God. Kohats, right? I mean, in between that also, Kohats were the only set of people who are set aside who could touch or actually move this ark, not touch, but move this ark on their shoulders using these poles, right? So if you see this, right, it's very, very detailed prescription that the God is giving, right? And people who thinks that this is not something which is written as a story. This is God's commands which is written down, literally coming from God, right? I mean, there is no bigger benchmark of what obedience should be if we start to ignore this. And that's really what really happened in this story. As we go forward, let's look at some of the actions that led to this incident, right? David's action. So David consulted with the entire world, it seems like the leaders, commanders, a lot of people, musicians, everybody, right? He organized essentially a block party, if you may, right? To in a celebration to bring about this ark. What he forgot to do, what he did in chapter 5 is really consult with God and say that, God, do you want me to do this right now? Right? So I think there is an aspect of, yes, he is zealous to go do this for God, for sure. But in that also there is a clear requirement, or at least a perceived requirement from God, that you got to consult, even if you're doing God's work. Right? So that part is not very coming through. I mean, there is a mention of this. So the detailed version of this is in First Chronicle 13. And if there is a slight mention of how he goes and tells people that, hey, if it's good for you and good for God, but there's no detail about, like, did he ask? Because in previous chapters, if you see, there is a direct one-on-one conversation with David and God, where God is literally answering his questions as he asked, right? And that did not happen, of course. And then he is not very keen on this whole, let's look at what is prescribed as to how this has to be moved, as opposed to how did, last time you probably would have asked, hey, how did we move it last time? And somebody said, ox cart. Let's go with that, right? Incidentally, that was the way the Philistines moved it, right? So not a good strategy, I would say, in that scenario. And of course, the entirety of Israel, 30,000, right? And the choicest men of Israel were in that group. And nobody seems to have said, this is not the right way, right? That's you and me, right? That's you and me in our lives, right? Are we able to stand up and say that, hey, something is not right, whether is in real life, in church, outside church, wherever it is, right? If something goes wrong, it's not according to God's plan, and you recognize it, and you don't say anything, you are party to that overall failure, right? Overall that happened, right? Of course, Uzzah himself, right? Yeah, he was, and his brother Ahio were essentially driving that ox cart. Uzzah probably was on the ox cart, and ahead of it was Ahio. And then, of course, he feels okay. I think somebody point out the fact that he just considered it as an artifact, just as another expensive box, or he did not understand the importance of how it has to be transported, or how it has to be taken. Who has to take it, who is allowed to take it, who is allowed to even come near to it, right? Because there is that gap exist, right? If you start to think that anything is okay and the holiness of God is to be ignored, right? At least in that time, right? Of course, we're going to talk about what's now, but really at that time, that gap existed. And the gap was created at the Adam and Eve's time, right? When that separation had happened from God to man, right? We are not apt, our sinful nature doesn't allow us to be in contact with God at that time, right? So, of course, Jesus Christ fills that gap with the new covenant, right? He is the high priest for us. We don't have to rely on high priest as during the Israel's day, right? We don't need that human high priest, right? So that gap is filled with the new covenant. We are sanctified in a way. We are at least allowed to be in connect or commune with the God, but not them, right? They had a prescription of how this had to be done, and so he just forgets all that, and maybe in his ignorance or zealousness to help, he just supported the ark. So last line I've just written maybe sort of summarizes all that, and of course everybody already knows, or at least expressed their impression on why his death was caused. It's a prolonged disobedience. It's one bad decision after another, and the overall sloppiness of how to handle the God's holiness. That's probably was the last straw, right? At which this punishment was dealt to Uzzah. Right? So of course, one of the thoughts I want to maybe leave you with is that a lot of this orchestration obviously happened at David's level, right? So David had this plan. He brought up the people. All this did. He, as a leader, could have essentially said, "Stop it! This is not the way we're going to do it, right? We're going to do it the way God told us to do." Very easily could have done it. Could have prevented this death as well, right? So I'm not going to dwell into that, but that's an interesting thought as to why David himself did not get punished for this. It surely looks like he deserves, or at least his disobedience is pretty clear in this one as well. He is doing what is normal or which is acceptable by the people that he sees on an everyday basis, not acceptable to God. He is not trying to please the God in this particular scenario, I would say. Right? He's clearly doing something which is normalized, right? So we have got to think about this as well, right? In our lives, in our religious lives, church life, everywhere, right? This dilution of what Christianity really means, or what is really God, or our walk with the God. If that is happening, are we doing enough to stop that? So that's really one thought I'm going to leave you with, and then as an application, right? I'm going to leave you with these three, right? So of course, so obedience is not an option. I think I said it before as well. Obedience is not an option, but what obedience means to you and me could differ, right? I mean, everybody has to figure that out, right? And so here the clear message is the sincerity of heart, like both on the front of, David as well as Uzzah, is not a substitute for obedience. You cannot say that my heart was sincere, or I was ignorant, or I was just supporting. God doesn't need your support, as somebody again nicely brought it out, right? God's ark, which went alone to Philistine land and came back as is, destroying everything in its path, is good enough, and it's okay for it to fall even if it would have fallen, right? It doesn't need Uzzah to protect it. That's really the last point here. But middle point is God. We are in loving relationship with God, but it's not casual. There is something called as holiness of God, right? You got to be on your watch when you are in presence of God, right? And so what does that mean? And we'll explore that in the second question as well. But really, once we start to forget that, and in our zealousness to just, I'm going to do this for the God, that if that kind of a thought is hitting your mind and your heart, you are wrong. God doesn't need you. You need God. I need God, right? God doesn't need us to do things for him. It might sound a little controversial or weird, but that's what I really feel what's happening here. Once we, in our ignorance of trying to help God, help situations, right, we jump into these things thinking that we're going to help. That's not required of you. Obedience, humbleness, that's what's really required of you. Okay. Let's go into the second question real quick. So just do a time check here. I think we're good. So the second attempt is, as I said, I already said in the pretest, right? Like it was successful. Of course, Uzzah's death was a really shocking event, if you may, right? As I said, the music literally stopped. They were singing and dancing, and a lot of musicians, all this pageantry, if you may, right, came to a complete halt as soon as God struck Uzzah down, right? And so if you imagine this, right, a new king, a new bright new city is trying to reinstate the ark into that city, and then he is doing this big party with 30,000 of most prominent people of Israel, and suddenly it ends up in killing of one of the persons, ends up in disaster. And of course, the ark itself has not gone back to Jerusalem, which is what they started to do. So you can imagine all the different emotions as a king David would have gone through as soon as that has happened. His plan has literally failed. As a matter of fact, he had to hold of his plan, and then take that ark and maybe place it in Obed-Edom's, the Gittite's house. There's no much detail about him. It seems like he's a Levite, but there is some confusion about where he comes from, and I try to explore it, but most of the places it says that he's a Levite who lived nearby, right? And that makes sense in the overall context, right? And so the question is, so there is an expression inside that passage where he says that David was angry, and then of course he was fearful of the Lord. Right? I would be, right? I personally would be, to see somebody, God reaching out and taking, literally striking somebody down dead. I would be too, right? So what new understanding he had, right, which allowed him to be successful the next time? So that's really the question. What did he learn from it? And then, of course, this ark was placed in Obed-Edom's house for next 3 months, and then he saw how his household was getting blessed, and David understood that the God's anger is out, right? And this is probably the right time to take the ark back to Jerusalem, and that's exactly what he does. So what did he learn in these 3 months, maybe right after the death of Uzzah? No, I think in the interest of time we probably can go forward, but I think you guys covered pretty much what I wanted to talk. But let me just walk this through as well, right? So, I already talked about the importance of the ark itself, right? So David realizes that, it's going to be becoming the center of Israeli life, right? His kingdom essentially, right? And so, any failure to do so would have repercussions, right? Of course, um, there could be some doubts, right? Really, what's the relationship between God and David? People would start to doubt that as well, right? Here is David, anointed by God, wanting to do this really important thing, and then God himself is preventing him from succeeding, right? Another aspect to look at is, of course, David was trying to get the presence of God itself, yeah, among the Israelites. But the way the presence showed up probably was not something that they wanted, right? In the threshing fields of Nakon, when God showed up, literally to kill Uzzah was not what is expected, right? So obviously, I'm just trying to make some observations as to why this would be shocking, and it might actually lead to some anger as well, right? As well as so there is an aspect of this as well, the guilt, right? I mean, maybe once this event happened, maybe until that point he was not clear about the fact that he has something to do with this death, right? So maybe at that point he started to also realize, right, that really, this is something that this could cause some there is some guilt aspect to it. This could really be something that based upon my doings, my plannings as well, right? And I think the David Sangor was really based on his confusion, right? So he was really again thinking about, hey, my intention is good. He probably was not thinking at the divine level, or at least at the anointed level, right? He was probably thinking more general, right? Like just maybe something of this sort does happen to any of us, we would also think, why me, right? We have that thought, isn't it? We know all these things about God is in control, God is my shepherd, all these things we know. But when the chips are down, right, when things happen to you and me, we have that innate feeling that why me, right? I have always led my life well. I never wanted any bad for anybody. These are the things that just sort of comes out of us, isn't it? So I would say that although there is still, I agree to the fact that there is no clear verdict on this is the reason why he was angry, or here is the reason why he was sad, but that seems to resonate, right? I mean, in terms of what a normal person would react to, right? Especially if he or she is clear on the fact that their intentions are absolutely on the right track, right? So a little bit more into it. So he's trying to, in his mind, he's trying to honor Lord, but essentially that effort of his, although, and then of course, that realization that he did not consult. I think somebody brought it up as well, right? It's sort of coming to home, right? The fact that even though he was moving and shaking all these things together so that he can do work for the God, but he did leave God out of it, that planning. He did leave, he used his abilities only essentially, right, to bring about this big change in the lives of Israel, right? And this really important thing. And the glory essentially, probably would sit with David and his ability to marshal his divided tribes to get this done, right? So that is coming home to roost essentially, right? And then of course the public humiliation, right? So here is his thought might be again speculative, right? It is not really from the Bible, but it really can, you can see how he has arranged for all these things to have that one big bash, and essentially on the day of that bash, you are literally, your plans comes to a grinding halt, right? So God did make his presence, as I said, God did make his presence felt, and then the entire Israel realizes the awesome power of God. Although the event which sort of crystallizes that is the death of Uzzah, right? So in a way, God does give David what he wants. He just is not realizing that, right? The fact that this kingdom has to build under God, right? That fact is sort of unsaid in this, right? So people do realize that, but just that it is not in the way he wants, and that's really the essence of you and me also, right? We never see seems to gather from the fact that in some of the things that is probably looks unjust, probably looks, why is God doing this to me? I'm working for God. Why is it happening to me? We have that mindset. I'm not saying everybody has it. I'm saying that a lot of times, you may have experienced that kind of a talk from somebody. You must yourself might have had that come from within, right? Saying that, hey, I'm all about God, but why is God giving me disease, poverty, all these kind of things, right? And then you question the whole relationship, right? And that's what this is all about, right? And then of course the awesomeness of God is really that humbles him, right? He understands what's said in Romans 6:23, the wages of sin is death, right? And his anxiety is going up because of this fact. He realizes, starting to realize that maybe Uzzah's death is not very, yes, here is what Uzzah did, and now you're dead. Yes, although the last, as I said, the straw that broke camel's back is essentially him touching the holiest of holy. But really, he understands now that it's a shared responsibility, right? Of him as a leader, of course, entire Israel, right? And as a matter of fact, he understands the fact that all of them has sinned on that day, and it's only through the grace of God that they are not all killed, because that could have been an option if you think about it, right? And it's the same thing for you and me, right? We are all sinners, right? When we concentrate on little things and question what God has done, we forget the fact that all of us breathing today is because of the fact that God is loving. God is still letting you live, right? That's the big piece we always miss, and then just go and say, is Uzzah's killing right or wrong? We just start to question that, right? So that's something that really, something we got to watch. We got to learn from David, and I think that's the growth David has when he goes for the second attempt. So let me do just a quick time check. I think we are still good. Let me leave you with this applications, right? So we talk about fear of God, we talk about obedience, and we talk about humbleness, right? So there is plenty of verses. I could have filled this page with verses which just talks about that from this different perspective, and giving you some insight about these three things, right? So when you talk about fear of God, I love what is said in 1 John 4:18, right? There is no fear in love, but perfect love casts out fear. For fear has to do with punishment, and whoever fears has not been perfected in love, right? So it's not about, are you scared of God, right? It's not about that. It just means that you're getting transformed. Your work is still ongoing. I think in one of the previous messages, or at least classes, I said, whatever is implanted in you will grow, you know will grow. That work will be finished. That's a promise that comes from God, right? Of course, we have to wait, we have to put in our efforts, but that will happen. But if you are fearful of God, that simply means that the work is not completed yet, the perfection is not done yet, right? But once you are completely, your work is done in you, right? This punishment is not going to be a fear for you. So don't fear the fear, if you may, right? At the cost of sounding a little funny there, really don't fear the fear. That just means that it's a litmus test, isn't it? That whether the God's work is happening through you or not, right? So it's okay to stay in that fear of God till the perfection is or achieved by the God, not through your actions, of course. There is nothing you and I can do which will eliminate that and hasten this, right? Yeah, there are things we can be obedient, all those things we can do, but it is through grace of God that we can reach this state of not having fear for our God, right? So that's one thing. Let's look at the obedience, right? So what is the significance of obedience? So literally the generations are affected, like when you decide to be obedient versus non-obedient, right? For by one man's disobedience, this is Romans 5:19, many are made sinners. Adam and Eve are probably talking about that, right? So by one man's obedience, many will be made righteous. God, Jesus, right? So that's the significance of obedience. You're not talking about a day or two. This is eternity, right? So if God says that I don't think Sushi likes the word expect, but I'm okay with that. If God expects obedience, We need to figure out how to be obedient. That's a Christian life, isn't it? That's the cleansing that happens on a each everyday basis. We decide. Free will is there, right? We decide to be obedient or ignorant about being obedient to God. I would venture to say that, one way or another, maybe our understanding of Bible, God, everything, the religion itself, right, might be at different places. But there are certain things which is absolutely written into our hearts. We know what is wrong. We know what is right. We choose to do wrong. That's disobedience. Right? And it's not just one day thing. It's not like Rajiv can switch on a light on Monday morning and I'm obedient. Right? I think this perspective actually, Sushil only brought it up to me. It's a continuum. It's a process. It cannot be done like, as I said, just on a day or a 2 day, right? God, if God willing, yes, it can be done, possibly, right? But it's a continuum, and it's a continuous sanctification that happens. And then, you understand what is obedience means to between you and God, you and your creator, essentially, right? Last but not the least, humbleness, right? Humbleness is not about, I am humble, I'm going to give my seat to a pregnant lady, right? There's a confusion around that, right? I mean, that's not humbleness. That's being nice. That's great. That's a good social thing that you can do for the pregnant lady. But that's not what humbleness is, right? To just to when you start to think that you can plan your life or big events of your life, bringing back the ark, right? In this case, right, for David, and he can just do that without God's involvement, sort of assuming that God is there, just taking him for granted, right? That's not being humble, right? To get into that mindset that I'm going to fall on my knees before I climb the mountains all the time, every time, that's humbleness, right? So that is really what is on Matthew 23:12. Whoever exalts himself will be humbled. Israel in this case, David in this case, right? And whoever humbles himself will be exalted, right? In the second portion, when he was successful in bringing the ark, he was not caring about what he's wearing. He was not caring that he is the king of Israel. He was jumping and leaping and dancing. He was simply wanted to be joyful in front of God, humble. He was not trying to be all kingly and like walk around with his dress code itself was not kingly on that day. He was wearing an ephod, which is meant for priest, right? So that's being humble. He understands what awesomeness is standing in front of, right? So it's not about, as I said, it's not about the deeds, it's about what's written in your heart. If you do humble things, that's just doing things to get into the favor of God. You can't do that. It's not expected of you. It is not a prescriptive way of being humble, right? So I would recommend, obviously, this is one among the several ways in which humbleness and fear of God, as well as obedience, disobedience, can be seen in Bible. I would highly recommend you to go use that and see what works for you. What's hitting your heart, right? This obviously was something that was coming to my heart, right? So with that, I think for first time, I think I'm on time. I think we can probably get into the breakout session. Manu, are we still okay to do this?
Yes, yes, we can do it.
All right. So the setup is this, guys, right? So as I said, I gave you a prelude in the last slide. So finally, they are able to bring the Ark of the Covenant, a major significant event in the history of Israel, and he is able to finally bring it into Israel and put it in the tabernacle, right? That he built exclusively for this Ark, and he's happy and he's dancing around. But his wife, right? Here is how we support each other as Christians, right? Sometimes I would say, his wife Michal essentially she's not happy. She is in the spirit of Saul, I would say. She's having that spirit. He's her father, and she's looking out of the window and saying that, hey, here is this person. He's the king of Israel, my husband, he's dancing half naked, if you may, with just the ephod on, in front of the slave girls, essentially, right? And so she's calling not only as unbecoming of king, she's calling it as absolutely vulgar. And she despises, this is what she said in the Bible, she despises him in his heart, right? and she confronts him. She tells him as it is, right? As soon as he walks in. So after placing the ark in the tabernacle, right? Everybody is fed food, and everybody is going back, and everybody is going back to bless their homes. And David is actually coming back to bless his home as well. And that's exactly when this confrontation happens, where she is upset about the fact that how he presented himself in front of the normal crowd or normal people of his kingdom, essentially, right? And what I liked about David is his reply is quite immediate. He says, I'll make myself yet more contemptible, right, than this. So he will probably do much more than this, and it doesn't matter to him, right, like what she's saying, because he's in front of the God, right? So he is. So to me, right, he's very joyful, and joyful at the time when he's almost 100% obedient to what God wanted him to do, right? If there was is again, as I said, it's not like 95%, 97.5%. It's like you do what God told you to do, and that's exactly why the ark was able to come back to Jerusalem, where it was supposed to be, right? So he's finding joy in being 100% obedient. The question is, first of all, is it even possible for you and me in 21st century, in 2021, to be 100% obedient, right? And what that means, obedience, as I said, it's a grade. It's not just, for everything you're going to ask, can I drink water, God, and then go drink water. It's not that, right? It's the definition that you have it in your heart, like you all will have that definition, right? Is it even possible, first of all, be 100% obedient, or is it just meant for the time of David, past era, right? It's something that we have to take it with a grain of salt, as they say, right? So what's your opinion? Maybe you can discuss that in a breakout group. I think I could cover what I needed to, but I just want to, again, this question, what I asked again, is it something to think about, not just for this session, but to just constantly think about and see how your relationship with God, right? In this case, now we don't need much of a mediation because of the price that Jesus Christ has paid on our behalf, right? We can approach God. We don't have to figure this out by just using our intellect. We can pray about it. We can ask God to give you and me the understanding, the discernment that is required to figure out how to be obedient, right? It doesn't have to be done just you and me sitting in a corner and figuring it out. You cannot. That's really the point, isn't it? So and then, as I think Manu brought it up, right? Ignorance is, or the goodness of heart is not an excuse. We have to be aware as a Christian what that means for you and me, obedience and humbleness. What does it mean? And deploy it wherever you can and however you can, right? And 99 is not an option. That's really what I want to leave you with.
Thank you, Rajiv. Sushil, you
May
want
I
to add?
take, Manu, can I take 2 minutes just to
Sure,
share
sure,
some thoughts?
sure,
Because there's just Rajiv touched on this. Just wanted to share some thoughts
sure, sure.
on this portion, right? So if you look at God, when He created man, no, He created him so that He could have fellowship with Him, and that broke in the Garden of Eden. So there is a separation between God and man, and that is symbolized by what we saw today: inability of unclean man to approach a holy God. It can, all men are unclean, and you deserve death. And there is this big chasm that separates God and man. So that is today's portion. And that chasm doesn't allow an unclean man to reach out and touch anything associated with the holy God. On the other hand, when you look forward in the New Testament, we read about this woman with that hemorrhage of more than a decade who reaches out and touches Jesus. And she is not chastised, she doesn't die, and she's healed instead. So I was just reminded of this famous Campus Crusade uses that picture, right, of this chasm that separates God and man and the cross that bridges the chasm. So actually, this portion, and we remember if you reflect on that portion of this woman touching Jesus' cloak and the hemorrhage being healed, it just shows us how much, what is God's plan and where it's going, right? When you compare the two, it's Jesus who's standing in the gap, this chasm that's opened out between man and God. Jesus is standing that gap for us. And through him, we can approach God. You can touch Jesus, right? And he bridges that gap. That's just the point that I wanted to bring. This portion actually, in a way, bridges from creation to Jesus' time.